Before we dive into today's mystery, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep uncovering the unknown. Now, let's begin. The small town of Willow Creek had always taken pride in its faith. At the heart of it all stood Reverend Elias Monroe, a preacher whose words could bring even the most hardened sinner to tears. His Sunday sermons were the kind that sent shivers down the spine, leaving people in awe of his wisdom and conviction. To the congregation, Reverend Monroe was more than just a man of God. He was their guiding light. His voice, deep and commanding, carried to the church like rolling thunder, warning a hellfire and promising salvation. But if anyone had been listening closely, they would have noticed something unsettling in his tone, a hidden weight, a quiet torment buried beneath his holy words. No one dared to question the changes in his demeanor. At first they were subtle. His prayers grew longer, his presence more intense. His once warm smile now seemed forced, stretched too thin over a face that rarely knew rest. The town believed him to be a man burdened by the weight of guiding lost souls. They had no idea how lost he truly was. His wife, Naomi Monroe, had always been the picture of grace. Poised, gentle, endlessly supportive. She was the perfect pastor's wife. She had a quiet beauty, the kind that didn't need adornment. And her faith was just as unwavering as her husband's. They had been married for 10 years, their love a beacon to the congregation. But lately, Naomi had changed. She was quieter, more withdrawn. Her usual seat in the front pew sat empty some Sundays, and when she did attend, her eyes seemed distant, almost hollow. The churchgoers whispered about her behind their hymnals, but no one dared ask her why. Elias noticed, of course. How could he not? The woman who had once laughed with him beneath the willow trees now barely spoke. Her presence in their home felt like a shadow of what it once was, a whisper of something that had already begun to disappear. When he reached for her at night, she flinched. When he looked into her eyes, she turned away, and then came the late-night calls. It started subtly, just a quiet murmur from the other room when Elias had already gone to bed. He would wake in the darkness and hear Naomi's hushed voice, speaking in urgent tones. When he asked about it, she would simply smile and change the subject. Something was wrong. Elias was a man of instinct. He had spent years guiding people through their darkest moments, hearing their confessions, helping them mend their broken souls. But nothing in his years of ministry had prepared him for this, for the creeping suspicion that his own wife was keeping something from him. At first, he dismissed it. He reminded himself that Naomi was under stress, that she needed space. But the signs became harder to ignore. One night, as he walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, Naomi quickly ended a phone call. He didn't catch much, just a few hurried words before she hung up. But it was enough. Enough to make his blood turn cold. Then came the locked doors, the secretive glances, the scent of cologne that wasn't as lingering on her clothes. Elias told himself he was being paranoid, that these were merely tricks of the mind. But then one evening, he caught Naomi standing in their bedroom, staring at herself in the mirror. Her hands were pressed against her stomach, her expression unreadable. When she saw him watching, she smiled. But it wasn't the smile he knew. It was something else. That night, he barely slept. The truth came on a quiet Tuesday night. The night Naomi finally broke her silence. Elias had spent the evening in his study, flipping through old sermons, trying to drown out the noise in his head. But the doubts gnawed at him like hungry wolves. He needed answers. So, when he walked into the living room and found Naomi sitting on the couch, staring at nothing, he finally asked, "Who were you talking to?" She didn't react at first, just a slow blink, her fingers tightening in her lap. "Naomi." His voice was firm, the same voice he used in the pulpit, the voice that made people listen. She swallowed hard, and then she told him. At first, Elias didn't understand. The words felt foreign, disjointed, as though they didn't belong in his world. "I'm pregnant, Elias." For a moment, everything went silent. Then his heart swelled with relief. That was it? A baby? This was good news. But Naomi's face said otherwise. His breath caught in his throat. There was something else. "It's not yours." Elias felt the world tilt beneath him. The room spun, his vision blurred. His hands, steady in the pulpit, now trembled at his sides. Who? The word barely left his lips. Naomi's eyes glistened with something. Was it guilt? Fear? And then, softly, she spoke the name. Isaiah. Elias recoiled as if struck. His mind raced, searching for a way to make sense of betrayal. Isaiah, his closest friend, his right-hand man at the church, the man who had stood beside him for years, preaching about loyalty and righteousness, the man he had trusted with everything. Elias felt something snap inside him, a crack in the foundation of everything he had built, his marriage, his faith, his very soul. Naomi reached for him, but he pulled away. Her touch burned. Say something, she whispered. Elias looked at her, and for the first time in their marriage, he felt nothing. No love, no anger, just a void where something important used to be. He stood slowly, his movements eerily calm. His shadow stretched long across the floor, the weight of his silence pressing against the walls of their home. Finally he spoke. We need to pray. Naomi hesitated. There was something in his voice, something unsettling. Elias. At the church, he interrupted. Meet me there. Midnight. She blinked. Midnight? Why? Elias turned toward the door. Before he stepped outside, he glanced over his shoulder, his face unreadable. Come alone. Then he was gone. Naomi arrived at the church just before midnight. The night air was thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. A storm brewed in the distance, the low rumble of thunder crawling across the sky. The church loomed before her, its stained glass windows dark, the steeple piercing the heavens like an accusation. She hesitated. Something felt wrong. She hadn't seen Elias since their conversation. He had left without another word, his face unreadable. She had expected him to yell, to break something, to demand an explanation. Instead, he had asked her to pray. That should have reassured her. It didn't. Taking a deep breath, Naomi stepped forward. The heavy wooden doors groaned as she pushed them open, revealing the dimly lit sanctuary. Candles flickered along the altar, their flames casting long, twisting shadows against the walls. Elias stood at the pulpit, dressed in his white clerical robe. His back was to her, his hands resting on the Bible before him. For a moment, Naomi felt relief. Maybe he truly wanted to fix this. Maybe this was his way of finding forgiveness. Then he spoke. Close the doors. Something in his voice sent a chill through her. She hesitated. Close them, Naomi. Slowly, she did as he asked. The lock clicked into place. Elias finally turned to face her. His eyes were unreadable, but his hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages of his Bible. His white robe billowed slightly as he stepped down from the pulpit, his movements slow, deliberate. Do you remember our wedding vows? He asked softly. Naomi swallowed hard. Elias. For better or for worse, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. In sickness and in health. Her breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the Bible. I have given you everything. My love, my faith, my trust. And you, he shook his head, his jaw clenched. You gave yourself to another man. Naomi felt her pulse hammering in her chest. Elias, please. Kneel. Her eyes widened. What? You came here to pray, didn't you? His voice was eerily calm. Then kneel, Naomi. Pray with me. Naomi's legs felt locked in place. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. But she didn't move. Elias stepped closer. That's when she saw it. A knife, tucked within the folds of his robe. Her breath caught in her throat. Elias, you don't have to do this. Pray. His voice exploded to the church, reverberating off the walls. Naomi dropped to her knees, tears welling in her eyes. God, forgive me, she whispered. Elias tilted his head. Forgiveness? He let out a hollow laugh. You think God can forgive this? Naomi's entire body trembled. She had made a mistake coming here. She had trusted him. And now she was going to die. Lightning flashed through the stained glass windows, illuminating Elias's cold, empty eyes. Then the knife came down. By the time the sun rose, the church was a crime scene. The sanctuary was drenched in red. Bible verses were scrawled across the walls in blood. Her blood. The altar, once a place of peace, had become a sight of horror. And Elias Monroe? Gone. His car sat untouched in the church parking lot. His home was undisturbed, his belongings still in place. It was as if it simply vanished into thin air. The town was thrown into chaos. A preacher doesn't just disappear. Had he run? Was he hiding? Or had something even darker happened? Some whispered that he had been taken by God himself, that the weight of his sins had called down divine judgment. Others believed he had fled into the wilderness, consumed by madness. But the truth was far more chilling. Elias Monroe was found 3 days later, not in another state, not on the run, but in a rundown diner just outside of town. He was sitting alone in a booth, wearing the same blood-stained robe, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His Bible lay open before him, pages soaked in crimson. The waitress who served him later told the police that he hadn't spoken a word, only sat there, staring at his reflection in the diner's window, muttering scripture under his breath. When officers arrived, weapons drawn, Elias didn't resist. He simply looked up, his lips curling into a slow, eerie smile. "It is finished," he said. Elias Monroe's trial became the most talked-about case in Willow Creek's history. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer, a man who had twisted faith into something monstrous. The defense claimed he was a broken soul, pushed beyond his limits. But in the end, the jury saw the truth. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In the courtroom, as the verdict was read, he never said a word, never begged for mercy, never showed regret. His father, a retired preacher himself, sat in the gallery. He never spoke, never looked at his son. The church where the crime had taken place was shut down, its doors sealed, its congregation scattered. And as the town tried to move on, one question lingered. Had Elias Monroe always been a monster, or had his faith been the thing that finally destroyed him?